Hello, I'm Kathryn Haueisen, and I'm talking to you today from Houston, Texas. I want to tell you about a historical novel of mine that just came out in October. It's called Mayflower Chronicles, The Tale of Two Cultures. It was published by Green Writers Press in Vermont. This book was inspired in part by Lakewood Public Library. Does that seem a little strange to you? Well, let me explain to you. My mother was a reference librarian at Lakewood Public Library for many years during my childhood. So I spent a fair amount of my childhood hours at the library, both because Mom worked there and because I love libraries. When Mom retired, she took the experience that she had gained as a reference librarian over to Case Western Reserve and did the tedious work of documenting that our family is indeed connected to William and Mary Brewster, who arrived in this continent on the Mayflower in 1620. I grew up knowing that we were related to the Brewster family. I didn't pay very much attention to it, though, in all honesty, until I was approaching my own retirement years. By that time, I inherited all of my mom's notes. I kept them carefully preserved in a safe that we have out in the garage because Houston tends to flood a lot. And if we should have another flood, I wanted those documents to be safe. So they are in a flood-proof safe in my garage. I didn't do much with the story until I was ready for retirement, and I had a little bit more time to focus on writing and research. But I was inspired by the fact that one of my daughters had married into a large Latino family here in Houston, and some of the members of that family have Native American heritage. So that got me thinking about, I've never really been told much about what the Native part of that story was about. And here we see this fellow sitting out on a boulder, looking out into the harbor and thinking, uh-oh, they've got women and children and building supplies with them this time. It doesn't look like they're just here to trade. There had been a lot of trading going on back and forth between the European countries and the native populations all up and down the North and South America continents, for that matter. But the idea that they were going to come and stay and settle was still relatively new. Jamestown had been established only 10 years earlier, and I doubt that the people in New England knew anything about Jamestown just yet. So when these people showed up, it was cause of great concern. I began to research the story. I was privileged to go to England, to Scrooby, a little tiny village in the northern part of England, about 50 miles from New York. That's where the Mayflower story really begins. And it begins there with Scrooby Manor and the Brewster family. William Brewster was the bailiff of Scrooby Manor. That meant that he was kind of in charge of all the administrative details. Scrooby Manor was important because it was on the North Road, and the North Road connected London to Scotland. There's a lot of traffic back and forth by messengers and also at times by the royalty and by the upper level echelon of the established church of the day. And so it was a very important place. William Brewster had had a chance to study briefly down at Peter's house in Cambridge. That was another place that I got to go for my research. He had to come home before completing a degree, possibly because his family needed his help back home more than they thought he needed a degree. But in any case, he did study there. That's where he was introduced to the separatist movement. The separatist movement was a continuation of the Protestant Reformation. You're probably all familiar with the Protestant Reformation that began in Germany with Martin Luther in 1517. And King Henry VIII, I imagine you're very familiar with his story, that he was not getting a male heir to the throne. He figured the problem was his wife, so change wife, solve problem. He wanted a divorce. The Pope said, you can't have one. And he said, I'm the king. You can't tell me what to do. If I want a divorce, I'm going to get a divorce. I'll just establish my own church, and then I can do what I want to. So he established the Church of England. Well, there were two groups. We lumped them together as the Pilgrims. But there were two groups who thought he didn't take things far enough. One of them were the separatists. They didn't see any hope for this. They thought the church had just accumulated too much baggage through the centuries. They wanted to go back to a first century sort of in-home worshiping community situation. And they wanted to just totally separate from it. The other group, the Puritans, thought there are advantages to being part of a major hierarchy. It gives us more political and societal clout. So we don't want to get rid of all that. We just want to clean it up and get rid of some of the excesses. They are called the Puritans. So all of this is going on in northern England as the backdrop to what eventually becomes the Mayflower story. So I researched it there in England, and then I had a chance to go over to Holland, where they were immigrants for about a decade, and walk the streets where they would have walked, and saw the place where they claimed They took off to begin the journey that ended up on the Mayflower. They had to meet the Mayflower back in England. And also, I did some research at Plymouth, what we used to call Plymouth Plantation. It's now called Plymouth Patuxet. Patuxet was the native village that was there. It was wiped out by the plague that happened in the 1600s, right before the Mayflower arrived, which is why there was an ideal place for the English to establish their plantation. It's because the previous community was gone. It was abandoned. There was nothing left of most of the place except the bones that were drying in the sun on the beach because there was nobody around to bury them. So I did my research. I set out to write the book. I tried a couple of different approaches, and in the end, I decided I'm just writing a straight historical fiction based on real people, real events, and as realistic conversations as I can create, given the fact that we only have the documents of a handful of the English men about that chapter of life. We have nothing from the women that I'm aware of. The native story has been preserved by oral tradition until very, very recently. So I had to fill in some gaps in the story. But I have been as faithful to the events as I possibly could be with the research that I had available to me. So the book is in 5 parts. The first part is the impact of the Reformation in England and the established church and the attempts to refine or reform the established church. Things went fairly smoothly as long as Queen Elizabeth was alive. She was Protestant. She didn't really get that upset about things except the Catholics. She had a big issue with the Catholics. She eventually signed the order to execute her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who was determined to turn England back to Catholicism. So that drama was unfolding as the backdrop to this. In fact, William Brewster had been on the staff of Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State. His name is William Davison. And he had been an ambassador of hers down to the lowlands. William Brewster went with him. That's why he knew a little bit about the lowlands before he emigrated there. But when Queen Elizabeth was pressured by her Privy Council to order the execution of her cousin because they thought that's the only way they'd be able to preserve Queen Elizabeth's life, she ended up throwing William Davison under the bus and accusing him of not following her orders, when indeed he did follow her orders. And William Brewster lost his job at that point in time and went back to Scrooby, where he got involved with the separatist movement that he had learned about in the brief time he was down in Cambridge. So he was worshiping in one of the churches near Scrooby. A contingency of the clergy went to King James and said, we've got some good ideas for how we can make things even better here. And King James thanked them by removing 300 clergy from their pulpits. One of them was the pastor where Brewsters had been worshiping. So William and Mary said, well, not a problem. We have a big house nearby. You can just come and worship at Scrooby Manor. We'd love to have you. The only problem with that was Scrooby Manor was owned by the Bishop of York, some 50 miles away, who showed up every once in a while to collect the rent and to just check on things, how things were going. And so to hold underground worship services in the property owned by the bishop of the established church was not really a great idea. It put the family at great risk. They did that for a while, but the tensions grew so much that they decided that they couldn't do this, and it was too late to go back. They'd already cut their cord with the established church, and they were on their own. So they decided to go into exile, but we'll get to that part in a minute. Meanwhile, on the North American continent, the Native Americans were having troubles of their own. The pandemic had come. It had wiped out large numbers of their people. And early Europeans had kidnapped 24 of their young men and hauled them off to Europe to sell as slaves. So they were understandably very dubious about seeing more Europeans showing up, especially ones that looked like they wanted to stay. So that was what was going on among the Native Americans. Part of the story is about the one Native American, history knows him as Squantum, or Tisquantum, who had his freedom bought by 3 friars in Spain, and somehow or other made his way to London, where he lived in an English household and learned English, which meant later he was able to finagle a ride back over across the ocean as an interpreter, which turned out to be very helpful in negotiations that are coming up here soon. So part two is the Native American story. Part 3 is life in exile in Holland. They went first to Amsterdam, There was already a group of Englishmen well established in Amsterdam that had come over a few years earlier, so they knew people. They could get established okay. And they set out to settle into Amsterdam, but there were some conflicts going on, and it was a big city, and they were kind of getting lost as the new immigrants on the block. And Brewster remembered the good years down in Leiden with William Davison, so he proposed that they move down there. So they did. Their pastor was John Robinson, and William Brewster was one of the elders in the church and several other leaders among the community. They went down there, and life went well. William was able to get a job at the University of Leiden, teaching English as a foreign language. There were a lot of interest in learning English as a diplomatic language. It was a very handy language to know if you wanted to do international business or negotiations. So he taught English as a second language. Their younger two sons were born while they were there. Their son Jonathan got a job as a ribbon maker in one of the local factories. Life was okay, but it was also a challenge. Their children were growing up speaking Dutch better than English. This concerned the adults. Things were really pretty lax there, and while they were grateful for the religious tolerance of the community, they weren't so grateful for their equal tolerant attitudes towards some of the games and some of the pastimes that their children were learning. So they were beginning to get concerned about that. But what really got them into trouble was William Brewster and his publishing business. He established a publishing business and published some things that were fine, no problem, but he published some things that were religious tracts that were challenging the established church. He did it under an assumed name, but nonetheless, King James knew about it. They were smuggling these back to England. King James knew about it. He was irate about it, and he demanded that the Dutch figure out who this person was and get him to stop. Well, the Dutch were religiously tolerant and happy to have their English neighbors as long as they didn't cause any trouble and paid their bills and minded their own business. But they could not risk the ire of the King of England. They were a small country. They were caught between France and Spain and England. They needed England to be their friend. So choosing between a religiously rebellious immigrant or the King of England, it was not even a contest. So life got dangerous. They decided it'd be a good time to haul across the Atlantic Ocean and establish a new settlement. That, of course, was easier said than done, not just because of the obvious challenges of the distance and the cost of it, but because they were in bad favor with the King James, and he had to grant them permission to establish one. So they had to work through other people to get all that done and kind of stay in the background. They found people to finance them. They're called adventurers. And the adventurers didn't really care one way or the other who worshiped where and how they worshiped. What they cared about was, could they make some money? Well, they looked at the religious refugees who were requesting their help to finance the trip, and they said, we don't think you know enough to make any money for us, so we're going to send along some other people with you to fill out the ship. The community in Leiden had decided to split basically in half. About half of them would stay behind in Leiden, and half would go over on this adventure to the New World. That way, if things went well and they established a community, then the ones in Leiden would come and join them on future trips. But if it went badly, which is a very great realistic possibility, then they could come back to Leiden and pick where they left off. They were well aware of Jamestown and how many struggles they had had before they sort of stabilized and got going. They may or may not have known about the lost village of Roanoke. I'm not sure how much they knew about that, but they knew this was very precarious. So the adventurers said, fine, we will support this because we want people over there to establish new colonies for us, but you're taking these people with you. And among the people they took with them was Miles Standish. He was sent along as a military escort because they were pirates, and it was dangerous out on the seas. So that was the group that went. And that is the third part of the book, is how all that came to pass. The fourth part is the passage itself. Precarious does not begin to describe their situation. There originally were two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The Speedwell picked up the Leiden group in Holland and brought them across the English Channel. They met up with the Mayflower in Southampton in July of 1620. But the Speedwell sprung some leaks across the channel. So they were already on the ship. They didn't want anybody off the ship because when they're ready to go, they're ready to go. It's not like sitting on a tarmac in a plane today. They want you to stay where you are because when they get clearance to go, they don't want to waste time loading the plane again. So you're there. Only it wasn't a plane on a tarmac. It was a ship in a harbor for a long time. They repaired the speed well. They took off. The speed well leaked. They went back. They repaired the speed well. They took off. The speed well leaked. They went back, this time to Plymouth, England. And at that point, they abandoned the speed well. Everybody who was still game for this adventure crowded onto the Mayflower. The rest of them said, well, that was fun, but I'm going home. So 102 men, women, children, and 2 dogs, 3 of those women pregnant, finally set sail from Plymouth, England on September 6th on one calendar, September 16th on another calendar. Pick the calendar you like. They set sail about 2 months later than they meant to. They were crossing the North Atlantic during hurricane season. Now, they don't call it a hurricane. They didn't use that word then. But from the descriptions I've read of the storm they encountered, and what I know about hurricanes from living here in the Hurricane Alley down here in the Gulf Coast, I'm pretty sure it was a hurricane. So they nearly capsized. They really should not have survived what they had to survive. One of the women delivered a baby while they were out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They appropriately named the child Oceanus. The other 2 women didn't deliver the babies until they had arrived in port, but they were still living on the ship because they had not built any shelters. About half of those people died the first winter from the combination of the extreme temperatures, the lack of adequate shelter, the lack of decent food. Their food supplies were running low. They were getting really, truly desperate. But some of them lived through the first winter. They were ready to plant their first garden. And so they were out getting the soil ready, and in walks this Native American named Somerset, who says, "Greetings, Englishmen." Well, they were floored that somebody could speak English. And Somerset said, "I speak English, but I know somebody who speaks better English." So he went and got to Squantum, this man who had been kidnapped and then had his freedom bought and then learned English and then came back across as an interpreter. He came and spoke to them and explained that their great Massasoit is a title. Their great Massasoit, Usamequin, wanted to meet with them. So there's a lot of back and forth going on and making arrangements for when they're going to meet and how they're going to meet and how all that's going to go. But they do sit down and work out a treaty in one of the houses that was finished by them in the spring of 1621. That treaty lasted for 50 years, and I never knew anything about it until I started researching this book. That treaty, I think, is really important for us today because the natives were in really desperate straits from the pandemic that has swept through. The English were in really desperate straits from the deprivations of the trip that they had just made. And rather than fight, the natives could have easily have overtaken the English. Although they had a pandemic, they still outnumbered the English by quite a few people. They could have easily have just ended Plymouth right then and there, but they didn't. They worked out a treaty and they honored it for 50 years. I think we need to know that. So I end the story shortly after that treaty. The Mayflower captain offered to take them back to England if any of them wanted to go. He by now had taken pity on them and their plight, but they all stayed, and they did. So today there are like 35 million people descended from those people on the Mayflower worldwide, about 10 million of them in the United States. The count on how many Native Americans from that community, they're called the Pokanoket, I think the numbers vary greatly, but somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. Some of them, most of them in the New England area, but some in other places as well. So it's been a fascinating story. I've enjoyed researching it. The highlight of my research was when I was looking for a native to review this story for me, to approve it before we published it. I was introduced through a long, complicated story how, but I was introduced to 3 descendants of Massasoit Usamequin, a father, his daughter, and his daughter's son. The 3 of them reviewed the manuscript. They made some corrections. They gave me some new information that I had not yet found, and then they wrote the foreword to the book. We had plans to actually meet in person last summer. They had invited me out to meet their tribal council, but because of COVID, I was not able to travel. So that's something still to look forward to. So Mayflower Chronicles, the tale of 2 cultures. You can get it on bookshop.org. That's a nonprofit organization that supports local independent bookstores. I'm sure you can check it out at Lakewood Public Library, But if you don't want to wait for whoever has it ahead of you to return it, you can get it at bookshop.org, Amazon.com, or ask your local bookstore to order it for you. They'll know how to do that. It is available in ebook, print book, and we will soon have it out in audiobook. So as you get ready to either celebrate your Thanksgiving feast, or perhaps if you already have, I hope to set aside a little bit of time to express some gratitude for our ancestors, both the natives and the English, who came together 400 years ago and decided that working together and creating a treaty was the way to go forward. So blessings to you, and thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to get to introduce you to this story. I hope all goes well for you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.